This episode, I'm joined by Matthew Gandy, who is a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge. We discuss his book, Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space, alongside discussions broadly on urban ecology. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Matthew Gandy, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing a book which was published last year, 2022, by MIT Press. They were kind enough to give me a copy, so thanks very much to them. Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space, which is a book of on urban ecology, which I said to you before we started is a genre which this is my first foray into urban ecology, and it was an extremely fascinating book, and I'm not sure if it's specifically to do with urban ecology. Maybe urban ecologists would say it's also dealing with other things, but before we jump in with the ideas, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how this book came to be written.
Sure. Well, firstly, thanks very much for inviting me onto the podcast. I'm a professor of geography, currently working at Cambridge University. Previously, I worked for 18 years at UCL in London, where I set up the UCL Urban Laboratory. And I have a long-standing interest in urban environmental issues, which has ranged across topics such as landscape, infrastructure, and then more recently, urban biodiversity, urban nature has really become the main frame of what I'm thinking about. But in some ways, the idea for the book has been there for a long time, because when I thought about it, when I was writing it, I realized that it was my childhood fascination with these marginal spaces in London, places where I used to play. And somehow that memory has stayed with me. So I have this long-standing fascination with these marginal or spontaneous spaces of nature, which is, as you maybe imply, not necessarily the same as how urban ecologists would conventionally conceptualize the city or urban space.
Yeah, that was the impression I got. I think that's probably why I warmed to the book so much, was that sort of intro where you said those were the places that fascinated you. Because I remember when I was a child, just before we get into the ideas, when I was a child, play parks sort of bored me, I think, looking back, probably because there was this acknowledgement of, well, this has been, how have you planned fun? It doesn't really make much sense. And probably the same as yourself, when I'd go find some building site or some derelict house or something like that, it was far more exciting. So before we jump in, this is a strange one, because often I'm talking about thinkers or philosophers, and here we're talking about a broad theme. So I have to ask you the Hermitix question. So I'm intrigued as to who you will invite into this room, but you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Okay, it's not a question I've ever been asked before, but I'm going to suggest Xian Ngai, the cultural theorist, based at the University of Chicago. Sarah Ahmed, writing across a range of topics, extremely interesting and important work. And because you're allowed a dead person, I'm going to invite Walter Benjamin to join in the conversation. Okay.
I do not know of the first two. I know of Walter Benjamin, but not too well. Is there a thread between these three that they might homogenize together to answer or tackle some question?
For me, I think these 3 authors are very imaginative, and they're always tracing unexpected connections between observations, artifacts, transitory moments with larger ideas and concepts. So I think maybe bringing them together could generate some interesting discussion.
Why do you think it is, I guess, for yourself, that, you said you're drawn to these smaller, these fringe spaces, or these things which no one really focuses on, and these 3 authors do the same thing. I guess not the question of why you're interested in them, but why are you disinterested in the thing that's been made to be there? I don't want anything to do with that. Give me the hotel hallway sort of thing.
I guess I'm drawn to the idea of the unplanned or the spontaneous or the unexpected, and possibly that also links with this sense of because I'm interested in cities and urban space. This links in with the sense of the idea of perhaps wandering without a particular objective, just maybe wandering, looking, stopping, noticing, and somehow these small things can then somehow connect with some unexpected set of insights. So, to take the illustration of urban botany, which is something that I got quite engrossed in through my recent research, the idea that a small plant growing by the roadside is actually a trace of global history, and that we look at the small plant and we think, actually, yes, this tells us something about hundreds of years of complicated global history just here by the side of the road. And also, it's a kind of ironic extension of the controlled botanical garden to the whole city. So I've seen some interesting art projects where labels are simply placed by roadside weeds as a kind of ironic extension of the museum.
Are you? This is a big theme throughout your book. This notion of the it almost seems like a non-duality because people seem to still. There's a lot of dualities, actually. I think I'd say in your book. There's sort of urban and wild, or rural and city, and you seem to actually usurp these dualities and say, you know what, they're not quite right. The idea that the weed coming through the road, that's not really. It's not a duality between wild and urban. There is something more going on there, and do you think those I mean, if you agree with there's a dualism there, do you think that is sort of playing into the hand to a bit too much of the idea of like we can get rid of all of this and we can return to nature, we can return to the wild?
Well, I think that yes, I am wary of dualisms in the sense that I think they simplify knowledge and experience. So you mentioned the urban-rural distinction. I think it's very present, if not symbolically or culturally, and in certain kinds of spaces of agricultural production. Certainly, we can point to what we might describe as rural, even if it's, if you like, demographically less significant in certain ways in terms of trying to analyze economic change and things like that. So I think that the rural is still present. But I think this articulation between the urban and the rural is very, very interesting. And actually, one of my colleagues at Cambridge, Aman Barua, working in Indian cities, has been writing about cows and other animals in the middle of metropolitan spaces, so that the rural is very present, even if from a, let's say, a European or North American perspective, it seems less so. So I think it's helpful to hold on to that distinction. I think possibly the other thing is that somehow through thinking through the fact that a duality doesn't work quite well, sometimes generates quite an interesting conceptual synthesis. And in that sense, I think that I like to hold on to the complexity of things. That we want to try to categorize things, even separate things. But what if we're a bit more relaxed and try to hold some of these different fragments together? I think that can also be interesting.
Are you originally from? Would you say you're originally from rural or from urban? If we were to abide by that split.
Well, I mean, I grew up in inner London, so I'm very much coming from the urban perspective. But as I mentioned, being fascinated by the presence of nature right within the centre of cities.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel so? This is one of the negatives, the downside of growing up in rural Norfolk is that unfortunately you actually do get a bit fatigued of nature. You two different people see a separate thing because, well, I see that every day, and also being near the sea, I see this. I'm 5 minutes from the sea, so I see it every day. Would you say that it's almost like the inverse for yourself with regards to it? Like if I see a skyscraper, I'm sort of amazed by it because we don't have any around here.
I think I can say I'm still amazed by all things, all spaces. I find it all very fascinating. One on the particular idea that there's more nature in some spaces than others. There's quite interesting research showing that the level of biodiversity is often higher in cities than in rural or agricultural areas, because there's such a diversity of biotopes and so on. So sometimes if you like, the ecological data can be surprising in terms of where we think nature is.
So I'm right in finding this nature very boring.
Maybe.
Okay. I guess before we sort of jump too far forward, I would just ask you, what is urban ecology? Because it seems like a paradox in terms from the stereotypical definitions of those words.
Yes, I mean, I think that there are many competing definitions, both of urban ecology and urban nature. And in fact, for me, one of the most difficult tasks in writing this book was to try to navigate a vast and growing literature. So the introductory chapter was in many ways the hardest one to try to write. And I really settled on four broad definitions of urban ecology that I try to use in developing my argument, so that there is if you like, a first notion, which is the systems-based, science-based approach as used across a range of disciplines, very much based on trying to quantify specific facets of the urban environment, a kind of metabolic throughput model of different components, and is quite significant within resilience discourse, environmental engineering, urban planning, and so on. So this kind of quant-based, often increasingly big data and a dominant approach within education and research, you could say, is one block. And then a second strand I've referred to as observational paradigms. And this really certainly going back to the 19th century, and early botanists and ornithologists being completely transfixed by nature within cities through close observation, close encounters, sort of tactile, affective aspects of nature. And I think this close observation strand with links to natural history in some ways resurfaces through citizen science and a kind of a surge of fascination for nature on people's own doorsteps and things like that. So that strand is still very, very present. And then there's a third strand, which has been referred to as urban political ecology. And this is in many ways directly applying aspects of Marxist theory to understanding the production of urban space. And these, for example, the twin circulatory dynamics of capital and water and urban infrastructure, the production of parks, often as part of elaborate regeneration or property speculation schemes, things of that kind. And then a fourth, more recent strand, which I refer to as the ecological pluriverse, is a sense of opening up the sense of urban space to thinking about how we live with non-human others. So there's an ethical dimension here, and also a sense that perhaps our notion of what cities or urban culture is much more complicated. So you could refer to as multi-subjectival. So it's different bodies, both human and non-human, in all kinds of different configurations and situations within the city. And also implicitly as well, I think with this fourth notion, with the ecological pluriverse, it's also about taking, for example, indigenous knowledge much more seriously, ethnobotany, and completely different perspectives and approaches on what we understand nature to be. But I would say it's a more recent strand in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Non-human others is a strange term, because you could have said just animals, but it's clear that they don't mean just animals.
Yes, I mean, yes. Interesting that you should pick up on that. I mean, the idea of non-human others, certainly I'm thinking of other forms of life, so that I'm certainly not thinking specifically of just animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms. Why not? I mean, there's really interesting research which describes the millions of living organisms that cohabit our own bodies as one entry point in aspects of anthropology, for example. So there are radically different ways of conceptualizing what urban life is and how we relate to it.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there is an perhaps not overarching, but a shared task of what urban ecologists are trying to achieve, or would that be too much of a limitation? Like from these, in the sense that there is a scientific angle there, as you pointed out. Science would often have, well, we're undertaking this to try, prove, or find out more about this. Where does this lead us? Does it just grow our understanding?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that having made this separation, as it were, between different perspectives, it's a very interesting point. Where can these different ideas come together again? And I think that questions about the livability of cities and future cities begin to bring some of these perspectives together. So even if the language is rather different, so some of the scientific ecologists might use rather dry terminology like ecological services or something like that, and then artists and others will be talking about the effective joy of hearing birdsong or something. So even if the language and the conceptual vantage points are sometimes different, I think there is space for dialogue, certainly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So just to jump back to some like a term that you've mentioned, and I sensed not hostility, but I sensed you wanted to open up this term to say, look, perhaps we're almost beyond it. And I actually heard Slavoj Žižek mention this recently, where he just outright said there is no such thing as nature. So what is where do we go wrong with that term, nature? Because as we're talking about urban, we might say, well, on the mirror of that, or the reverse of that is nature, this pristine, pure, Edenic state that we're going to run into when we leave the city.
I mean, I think it's certainly true that the imaginary nature, the primordial nature, is a kind of a mirage and an unhelpful thing to try to strive towards. I mean, I have noticed within aspects of philosophy and political science and so on, there has been a certain swerve towards saying we don't talk about nature, or we're after nature or beyond nature. So there's Timothy Morton as well, Zizek you mentioned, Bruno Latour and others. I'm not so sure it's really helpful to try to remove an extremely important word. I mean, I think I would come back to another cultural theorist, Raymond Williams, who describes nature as one of the most complex words in the English language, mm-hmm. and maybe starting from that point and say that there's a fascinating cultural history bound up in the word, and I think if we're critically reflexive about the words and concepts that we're using, then I think that's fine. Conversely, the term ecology has suddenly popped up in every domain as if that's a kind of straightforward jump from nature to ecology. Ecology is also extremely complex. I don't think it necessarily gives a straightforward entry point either in terms of the things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And neither, as well, my favorite word of all time, does modernity, which comes up, and any guest who mentions modernity, because it's like a fascination of mine. I mean, and these are, in a way, I think this is like the smorgasbord of terms that we're using is urban, nature, and then this almost like the interplay is modernity in a way. It's something that has to wrestle with both. So what is modernity for you? Because it does play quite a big role in your book.
Sure. I mean, I think with modernity, I think it's actually helpful to step back a little and try to differentiate modernity from two related terms, modernization and modernism. And that, I think, is quite helpful, so that in talking about modernity, I'm thinking more of a broader sweep of a certain kind of a self-conscious differentiation, if you like, of now from the past and also future possibilities. So it's a certain attempt to reconceptualize the direction of human history and the possibility to steer it in a certain way. So a certain awareness, if you like, of possibilities for historical change. And then nestled within that in certain ways, we have modernization, which I see as more kind of specific, particularly socio-technical or scientific developments in urban infrastructure, medicine or other areas, particularly from the 19th century onwards. And then that last term, even nestled within that, like sort of Russian dolls, is modernism. And I preferred a more precise set of definitions from architecture and art history, where you're talking about very particular developments in art, literature, and other areas, which become very significant in the middle decades of the 20th century, and then are heavily critiqued with the rise of postmodernism and other developments. So more of an aesthetic element. So somehow within that, maybe that just gives a sense of how I conceptualize the way these terms might be related.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, modernity in relation to future possibility, because that's not something you hear much anymore. Do you feel, in relation to what you're writing about, that notion of future possibility, of even just possibility of potential towards something more, something new, something original, do you think that's become quite a little bit stagnant?
For me, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about looking more closely at urban nature is we see traces of alternative futures in terms of unusual ecological constellations or configurations, unusual plants or animals in combination. We have, in a sense, glimpses of the future city through these sort of marginal or sidewalk ecologies and so on. I also think, and you mentioned possibly, I think before we started our conversation, you mentioned something about feeling like you were entering the landscape, a J.G. Ballard landscape, through the way I was conceptualizing urban space, which is intriguing to me because Ballard is one of my favorite novelists and hugely influential for me. And his interest in, I think he described it as a near future. So some people see him as a straightforward science fiction writer, which I don't think he neatly fits into that genre, but he's kind of fascinated by just looking a little bit further ahead if certain things have gone in a certain direction. And particularly, I think he has this fascination with these kind of sort of fissures or spaces within modernity, or moments or spaces of breakdown. So there are certain motifs like the abandoned swimming pool that occur. And this, of course, is ecologically extremely fascinating. So in some of my other work on urban epidemiology, I've looked at the way that abandoned swimming pools harbor certain mosquitoes, which are significant for the transmission of particular illnesses such as West Nile virus. So if you look at North America and the foreclosure crisis, you can track certain diseases in relation to this destabilization of the housing market. So there's to maybe link even back to the urban political ecology perspective, there are specific ecologies associated with some instabilities within the circulation of capital and house building. And it's somehow through the imagination of somebody like J.G. Ballard, it's like these different disparate strands seem to link together in unexpected ways.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So before we started talking, I said that reading your book was like reading a possible character in a Ballard novel has instead of sort of panicking, they often sort of panic when they're, high rise while you're trapped in a skyscraper. Was it Kingdom Come? Trapped in a mall. And my favorite Ballard, which is Concrete Island, just people existing in this sort of mode where it's oddly described, which is what I like about that novel, is it's never really specifically described, other than a lot of these glimpses of people pulling up their cars on the motorway that the person has fallen from, and living in one of those spaces that often when you're on a motorway and you look out of your window, you think, who is even dealing with that? Like, who's dealing with this space? One of those small boxes where there's, I don't know, probably electrics or something, and you think, this is so strange. So it's almost like someone had, a character had gone there, and instead of having their usual existential crisis, had said, well, let's just document what this is as a place. Yeah, I mean, those were just my thoughts on the book, and I think it seemed like almost a conversation with Ballard, sort of silently in a way, because he's someone who's, yeah, as you say, explicitly dealing with this, and I don't think people often emphasize that element of his work, that he does focus on architecture and space and the strangeness of. I mean, it's almost always in one of the places that you would be describing, really.
Yes, absolutely, and I think there's possibly connections with Rainer Banham as well, and his classic book, The Four Ecologies on Los Angeles. And being very interested in these new spaces created through the highway network and so on, which Ballard also writes about. I mean, I think that with Ballard, I think that because he's such an interesting figure in many ways, I think, returning to your question about modernity, I think he poses those really intriguing questions which make us reflect on what we understand modernity to be, and also its fragility, that in a way the taken for granted worlds are not necessarily as they seem.
What is it we take for granted, do you think?
I mean, in terms of urban infrastructure, which I've done a lot of work on previously, in simple terms, in most European and North American cities, for example, it's just assumed that turn a switch, the light comes on, turn a tap, there's water, etc., etc. And yet, of course, I have colleagues, for example, Katie Meehan at King's College in London, talking about water poverty within some of the richest cities in the world, like San Francisco. So that it's even when we assume that we're part of a shared infrastructural universe, nevertheless, there are people cut off from it in many ways. So in that sense, I think that infrastructure is part of our taken for granted world, but also this fragile world from which people can be cut off. Or, of course, in times of crisis, suddenly we realize the fragility of modernity when the systems fail.
I often think about this, especially as a sort of the condensing of time, I think, within people's understanding of things. Time sort of, what does Mark Fisher say? It's in relation to depression, to be honest, but in a way it's sort of poignant, a slow cancellation of the future, and I think also a slow cancellation of the past, and you end up in this present. And in relation to what you were saying, I think about just the idea of having mains water plumbed into your house in terms of human history is extremely new. I think if you work it out, it's sort of like the last 0.05% of all our history, and yet we wouldn't even question the idea of being able to go and do our business, and it goes away and we never think about it. So there's certainly something interesting about that. However, this notion of taking for granted, there's an interesting paradox, I think, here in the human mind. And it was so your book in being fascinated with these wastelands, you call them, and this really got me to thinking about something that fascinates me that I've never really been able to work out why, which is the contemporary fascination with post-apocalyptic and ruined worlds. People love them, and people seem to want to be in them. And the idea that someone might want to spend their free time visually in a film or in a video game or even audibly, because how are you spending your free time? In a horrible, worn-down world, it doesn't seem to make sense. So on the one hand, we have the urban space that we take for granted and is comfortable, but then on the other hand, we seem to desire that space to fall down just to see what's there. Why do we have this fascination, do you think? If you agree with me.
I think there has been this recurring cultural fascination, particularly with the abandonment of modernity and the sense of nature coming back or taking over. And there are many novels which have looked at this, and also speculative science writing. I wouldn't call it science fiction necessarily, but there's been Alan Weissman's an example. So this idea that, if we just stop, what happens? And then he goes through it. Within 5 years, all of the roads are covered in weeds. 10 to 15 years, tree roots begin to get into the foundations of buildings. Gradually, the taller buildings begin to topple and fall down, etc., etc. So there's this kind of speculative writing about what happens if we're not there, and I think that's something very, very interesting. There's also I came across a fascinating novel, Agustina Bazterrica, who's an Argentinian writer, with a different take, where nature itself has been eliminated, and the city is silent, apart from human noise. It's a very macabre novel. I won't go into more detail about it, but there are very profound political changes that take place, particularly in relation to food production. It's a world in which all animals are effectively dangerous and toxic to us, so we have to rethink how we live. But it's also, I think, a very interesting use of an ecological trope to explore repressed political memories and violence as well. So I think I mention that, I think partly because sometimes a certain literary genre can seem to overwhelm the field in terms of, we have a European romantic imagination about returning to nature, but there are other interesting counter strands as well, I think, in terms of thinking about alternative futures. But certainly I think the ruin trope and urban ruins is something that has been a kind of a long-standing strand. I mean, right back to the 19th century, I mentioned the origins of the observational paradigm and urban botanists. One of the first things they got really excited about were unusual plants growing on old walls or ruins, partly because the mortar between bricks and stones is quite alkaline, and it mimics the kind of rock crevices you might find in mountains. And you can actually find examples of rare mountain plants, ferns, for example, happily growing in urban ruins because it provides a similar kind of ecological niche.
I mean, there was this sort of push for a few years. I remember just seeing various books in sort of bookshops about this notion of rewilding. I think there was actually a very famous book simply called, might have even just been called Rewild or Rewilding. And do you think that's sort of wrong founded in that understanding? Like, as you're talking about, nature already is in urban. So would that be simply a process of like acceleration, or like accelerating the wild, even though you can't really do that? I mean, what does rewilding really mean?
I guess my hesitation is the part of rewilding, because I think that I can get the notion of wilding and spaces of freedom and creativity and imagination in that sense. The is more curious because it suggests that we're going back to something which was either never there or has been somehow conceptualized in a very strange way. I think quite a lot of the ecological rewilding discourse imagines some kind of ecological benchmark in the past, which is quite often this idea of a space or time where people were absent, and wolves and other large carnivores sort of roamed these kind of the savannas of Scotland or wherever, and it's actually it's very difficult to sustain that as a kind of as a serious kind of benchmark, because of course, even if we go into deep history, we know that ecosystems were very heavily altered by human action through fire or early agriculture, hunting of megafauna, things of that kind. So it gets, how far back do we go to have a meaningful sense of the element? And then I think it brings it back to a slightly different question in terms of, okay, what is the imaginary ecosystem that we really want to have? What should it contain, and who should it be for? And in some ways, it's more helpful to think about a future-oriented rewilding in terms of what kind of future ecologies might emerge given specific conditions. And I think for people who try to think that this is a non-anthropocentric view, this is also a bit complicated, because the idea of rewilding has emerged out of human culture, and in a very real sense, it's aimed towards future human cultures and different modes of coexistence with nature. So I guess I'm a kind of a sympathetic skeptic, if you like, towards some of the ideas behind rewilding.
So that brings us to that discussion of like the role humans really are playing in this, and the notion of how far back do you want to go. It seems that the only way we could go back far enough is actually for the human to become like an animal again, I don't know, crawl back into the sea and just de-evolve or something like that. But this idea of the role the human plays, we've been speaking about nature. I mean, what would you perhaps make of this, the idea that as human beings are within nature, and it's almost within our nature to just build culture and develop culture and build skyscrapers as we do, that to sort of separate cities in that sense of saying they're not nature is a bit wrong, because they have developed out of the raw materials of the earth, even though they've been reworked or whatever by human hand. I always think that it appears in a qualitative sense that a skyscraper and a tree are emphatically different, but ultimately they're still both just materiality, and they're still both sort of being born out of the same substance in a way. So, in what way can we make a split between them that is productive and that acknowledges humankind, but also doesn't throw us right back into, crawling on the dirt and picking berries off a bush?
I mean, I think that the separation, if you like, of cities from nature is difficult to sustain. So the geographer David Harvey emphasizes the meaninglessness of this natural-unnatural distinction in relation to looking at urban space some years ago. I think in terms of what we understand nature to be as containing certain forms of non-human agency, so dynamic patterns or processes that are either beyond our control or need to be intervened in certain ways, say for public health or food production, things like that. So there's a differentiation of agency. Equally, I think if we're talking about the distinction between nature and history in certain ways, I think it's quite useful to remember that capitalist urbanization is a historically specific set of processes. And I think that's why you sometimes get these strange ideas. I've seen it in the ecological literature that kind of seem to suggest that market mechanisms are as natural as photosynthesis or something. They're just, part of a set of natural processes that extend to economics, as well as ecology, which is of course not true. So I think we do need to keep a hold, if you like, of the human intentionality and the historical agency, and also this other set of processes that are often intermeshed, if you like, with these different kinds of agency.
So a tough question from that: how might a capitalist and a Marxist urban study of or the urban ecology that you would study in these two separate realms, how would that differ? I guess the more important question is, what would be that sort of kernel which is underlying the key differences in what we actually approach in the physical world?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that within some of the more capitalist, what I call adaptive Anthropocene literature, which more or less assumes that the way out of our current predicament is more market forces, more rapid technological change, harnessing the dynamism and innovation of the market to reveal pathways out of where we are, ranged against a much more skeptical set of viewpoints. And I think that one of the stumbling blocks, I think, of the kind of almost accelerationist, sort of hyper-capitalist perspectives is the notion that nature itself is malleable and interchangeable. So there are some quite influential books from biology, which Chris Thomas, for example, suggesting that we shouldn't worry too much about the sixth mass extinction because actually human environments produce accelerated rates of evolution, and lots of, millions of new species will emerge from these reconfigured environments. And so this kind of, if you like, this faith in the dynamism and adaptability of nature as well as human technological systems leads in one particular direction. And I'm very skeptical. I think that this pathway is not going to lead in a good direction. And there's abundant evidence that global environmental systems are becoming increasingly threatening and unmanageable. And also that if we talk about the sixth mass extinction, there's this very profound idea that 80% of all the species on Earth will disappear within a relatively brief historical time frame, and I think that gives enormous pause for thought about the consequences of the current rate of environmental change, and also because in my current work, actually, I'm looking at what I'm calling zoonotic urbanization and global health threats, and it's very clear that this rapid destruction of biodiversity is releasing lots of potential pathogens, including COVID-19, incidentally, into a global circulation. So the mass destruction of biodiversity is certain to have profound epidemiological consequences in terms of new and emerging diseases and global health threats. So I'm much less optimistic than these accelerationist views, which seem to not really want to take seriously the material consequences of environmental destruction.
What's zoonotic?
Oh, sure. A zoonotic disease, in its most simple definition, is a disease passed from an animal to a person. And many of the most serious diseases in human history, tuberculosis, plague, rabies, and so on, have passed from animals to humans at different points in human history. And the coronavirus group, widely considered to originate in bats, have passed from bats, sometimes via intermediary animals, to human societies. Something like 70% of all diseases are of animal origin, and that's the term zoonotic. There is a slight complexity here in terms of vector-borne diseases, particularly via mosquitoes, malaria, yellow fever, Zika, and so on. And here there's a slight blurring because some of the pathways are also zoonotic in some instances. So although I use the broad-based expression zoonotic urbanization, I would also include the analysis of vector-borne disease within that as an analytical framing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned there just before that as well, our current predicament. What is our current predicament? Where does it come from?
In terms of, clearly, we face a range of environmental threats that we've briefly discussed, and I would say that we need to try to think about alternative futures. I've used the word ecological imaginary in my book, actually, as a way of trying to open up the possibility to imagine alternative futures. I think it's very worrying when it feels as if we're going down a particular track and there are no stops on this train, or whatever metaphor you want to use, or alternative lines. And I think it's really important to articulate alternative pathways. And in that sense, alternative ecological imaginaries, I would argue, are a way to reconceptualize relations between nature and human society. And one of the things I've tried to suggest in the book is that reimagining ways of living with nature in cities might have wider implications for a different kind of politics of nature. It's actually quite intriguing to me that some of the most progressive ideas about nature seem to be generated by metropolitan political cultures. And it's interesting that, to take one illustration, in Brazil, for example, Bolsonaro's support was so heavily skewed towards some of the more remote states, including Amazonia. And that's something I think that requires quite profound reflection, that how do we, in a sense, how do we build a politics that's attentive both to celebrating urban nature, but also protecting a more remote biodiversity hotspots, or possibly areas that fall within the zone of various forms of plantation agriculture or agrocapitalism, where there's often a very different kind of political configuration in play.
How do you imagine our ecological future if you were to be positive? Or if I was to be optimistic?
Okay, I mean, I would say, in terms of the way I look at things, I think an overly pessimistic perspective can lead to a certain cynicism or apathy or disengagement, and these things are very well known, of course. On the other hand, I think a sort of a kind of optimistic outlook, sort of bland optimistic outlook, the sort of adaptive Anthropocene I mentioned, is also dangerous because it most certainly will fail. So somehow in a middle band, I would hope, building a much more progressive kind of political engagement with nature and environmental questions. Also, I think the notion of ecological citizenship. It seems quite a bland term, but I do think that the more knowledge and engagement people have with nature and ecological processes, the greater the possibility to build a different kind of politics. So there are aspects of what's referred to as citizen science, which are extremely interesting to me, that if people are able to help monitor things like tree disease or the presence of invasive species, or just helping with ecological cartography, just noticing birds or plants in their own neighborhood and being part of larger scientific projects, I think that brings people in a potentially very, very interesting way. And maybe out of that, we can build different kinds of politics, because I think it also occurs to me that if we pay much closer attention to the ecological complexities or dynamics of urban space, maybe that also applies to things like land use policy, planning, architecture, health, education, other fields that are kind of a much more attentive or critically engaged kind of politics at grassroots level might scale up, would be my hope, I think.
Okay. I think that's a healthy optimism. That's sort of the third path. I mean, you're critical there of accelerationism, but I assume you would also be critical of like a decelerationism of, I don't even know how that would work, because the city would still be there. So there's sort of not really a third path, but something else that isn't to do with this forward or back. It's to do with dealing with the complexity of urban and ecology and the fact they're together now.
I think, that's a very interesting point. I mean, I think that there's been some amazing recent books like Kohei Sato, for example, on Marx in the Anthropocene. Great book. And he's tried to disentangle a kind of productivist dimension to progressive politics, as in we just grow the economy and share it out more fairly, and trying to fundamentally rethink social and ecological relations. And I think this is really important. I think that clearly an emphasis simply on endless economic growth is impossible in relation to a better ecological future. But that, of course, poses very profound questions about the way we live, what we understand a good life to be, how we can share possibilities for a good life, and all of these things. Very complicated, but I think all of these conversations and ideas need to be had, because I think that very clearly a continuation with a slight modification here and there almost certainly arrives at the same end destination.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone through all the sort of most of the questions that I'd outlined fairly quickly. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add about your book or about urban ecology that you wish people knew that we've glossed over?
I guess the only thing I would say is because I work at a university and I'm a professor of geography, and obviously research is a lot of what I do. I am also very interested in teaching and pedagogy, and also field-based teaching. And I really do like taking students out into the field, so to speak, to show them things. And I've also done some guided talks and walks for anybody who wants to come, like public events in London and elsewhere. And I really like that. I have a sense that it's making these connections and bringing people into things that can really open up these debates in interesting ways. And also possibly one of the downsides of a move to what we might call a digital culture or digital capitalism is that more and more of our lives is spent interacting, I guess, as we are right now, in terms of a kind of digital interface rather than real people or real places. So somehow re-engaging with the material world, I think, is a really important part of what we're talking about.
Do you think that first hand analysis, where I guess you could almost touch the thing and see how it works and see how it all fits together quite literally, do you think that allows for a deeper understanding of the complexity that we're talking about?
Yes, I do. I think the sense of a kind of multi-sensory immersion in the complexity of space and nature and all these things, the idea that you might notice plants and things and actually, reach down, touch the leaves as well as a kind of haptic thing, and and hearing maybe birds or insects and things like that. There's something very special about this sense of being immersed in spaces of nature within the city or elsewhere. And I think that's a kind of starting point, I think, to expand our imagination.
Mm-hmm. So do you still undertake these public talks for any listeners who might be in the London area or wherever you do them who might be interested?
Yes, sure. I mean, I do. I'm very happy to do things like that, of course. Yes.
Okay. So be able to find your book Natura Urbana on the MIT Press website, and I'll put links for that in the description below. Are you looking to write? What are you working on at the moment? More books on urban ecology, or is there a different specific area that you're focusing on now?
I think I'll always keep going with urban ecology and urban nature in different forms. As I mentioned, I'm developing some work around the theme of zoonotic urbanization and urban health threats. I'm taking a slightly different angle. I touch on this actually in the book Natura Urbana in terms of, for example, Zika or other particular health threats in cities. I also incidentally touch on the ethics of our relations with animals and non-human others, for example, food production and agrocapitalism, and that this is something that it interests me because I think that's part of what we're talking about. I think if we have these distant sites of mass cruelty, to put it bluntly, towards nature, that cannot somehow fit with a better way of living with nature or non-human others, that modifying what we eat, how our food is produced, is fundamental to what we're talking about. My colleague, the historian Chris Otter, has written very interesting work on this. So this is also an extremely important topic, I think.
Mm-hmm. So it's just delving into, I guess, the human culture in relation to the development of spaces and the change there at that root level towards perhaps, different form, away from factory farming at the least would be a good start.
Absolutely, and eating less meat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, I'll be sure to put the links in the description below. And as I said, this is also my first entry into urban ecology. So if anyone is looking for an entry, I would actually recommend this because it did give me a good overview and then went off to explain it in so many different facets that I thought it was, a fantastic book. So I'd highly recommend it. I'll put links in the description below. And Matthew Gandy, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.